In a world of social media hyperbole, Carmen Aguirre, the Chilean-Canadian artist and activist, is a reality check. She grew up literally as a revolutionary socialist, literally fighting a fascist dictatorship, that of Augusto Pinochet, under whom neoliberalism began. She went on to become one of Canada's most recognized writers, performers, and activists. Her award-winning plays, like Refugee Hotel and The Trigger, delve into the most challenging subject matter with remarkable artistry and humanity, while her memoir, Something Fierce, won the 2012 Canada Reads contest and has since been published and translated around the world. As someone who seeks real change from the neoliberal status quo, she has simultaneously worked to support historically marginalized voices, while also speaking out against the shortcomings she sees in identity politics. Many might find that a challenging balancing act, but it has been her hands-on transformational practice for many years. I look forward to picking her brain, getting those perspectives and experiences. Carmen Aguirre, thank you so much for being here this evening.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I'm looking forward to jumping in. I guess we'll begin with quite an extreme childhood. And you grew up having to hide aspects of your identity, having to travel to various countries under very dangerous circumstances. Can you give a little bit of both the historical context behind that extreme childhood and what it was like to grow up in those circumstances in your family?
Yeah, so I was born in Chile, and my parents were very, very active supporters of the socialist government of Salvador Allende, which was one of the first governments in the history of nation states to be democratically elected under a Marxist platform, like with an overtly Marxist agenda. So that was very exciting. So when the coup happened 3 years later, Allende was not able to finish his term, and he died on the day of the coup while defending the presidential palace while it was being bombed. My parents were immediately blacklisted, as it were. I'm making a long story short, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And we ended up being exiled in Vancouver. So we arrived in Vancouver in 1974. And I always make it very clear that we were exiles as opposed to immigrants, So I grew up in a state of exile, which meant that I grew up in a home and in a community where the objective was always to return, never to stay here, right? I also grew up in a socialist home, a socialist revolutionary home. So what that meant was that you are put on this earth to serve the poor, and be in solidarity. And if you need to lay your life down for that, that's what you do. And being a socialist, of course, that for me and for my family and my community meant fighting capitalism, and not only fighting capitalism, but fighting for a socialist vision, So that's basically this. I grew up here in Vancouver on the stolen land of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations. And in 1979, when I was 11 years old, my family went back to South America to serve in the Chilean resistance. They were blacklisted. They could not go back into Chile. They did go back, illegally. Yeah, but basically we ran safe houses in Bolivia and then Argentina and went in and out of Chile. And then when I was 18, I joined the resistance myself as a full member, and served for 4 years. Doing what was referred to as border work, which was extremely dangerous, as you can imagine. I was almost certain I wasn't going to make it, so when it was all over and I was 22 and I'm like, oh my God, I'm still alive, I thought maybe I'll kind of pursue my original dream when I was a very small child, which was to be a theater person.
Right.
And this is where you find me now, all these decades later. Yeah.
That's a very big story made very short. And it brings in a big question that I think a lot of us, we hear about capitalism talked about as something that is just trying to sell the best shampoo on the market and that it is often tied in with language around democracy. Democracy promotion is a particular term that's used for US foreign policy a lot of the time. And you've lived on a different side of it that perhaps people who grew up in Canada and the United States often might not know very much about. So do you want to speak a little to the history of capitalism and its relationship to democracy as you understand it from your experience and from those of those around you?
Sure, I'll try and make it short. I can talk about being a Chilean, and being a mixed race person, like that is to say, I look like many, many Chileans. Most of us have about 50% indigenous blood. In my case, it would be Mapuche, Diaguita, Aymara, and then the rest is Spanish blood, right? So as we know, the capitalist project came to be in England in the 16th century, more or less, right? And what we refer to as Latin America today was part of a capitalist colonial imperialist project from the time, from the late 15th century. What we refer to as Latin America has been there to provide raw resources and originally slave labor and now cheap labor to the global north. That is still the role of Latin America in conjunction with local elites, right? So if I go back to Chile, what Allende was doing, what his project was doing, was one of the first things that he did when he was elected and took office was that he nationalized the biggest copper mine in the world, which is called Chuquicamata and is in the Atacama Desert. And that is when the coup started to be planned by the CIA in conjunction, and multinationals, of course, including Noranda, which is a Canadian multinational that had shares in Chuquicamata, and Noranda ended up helping to fund the coup.
There was Canadian money behind it.
Oh, yes. Everything I'm telling you as an aside is not my opinion. I make sure that when I talk about these particular things, it's not opinions, it's actual facts that you can look up. Yeah. Trudeau Senior, right, was also in favor of the coup. During the Allende government, there was a blockade, a US-led economic blockade against Allende's government. Nixon gave the order to make the economy scream. And that's what they did, right? And Trudeau participated fully in that blockade by refusing to give the socialist government any kind of loans. And Canadian banks shut down their banks in Chile during the socialist government. And then the loans were offered again when Pinochet did the coup, and the banks were opened again, and Noranda got some shares back in Chuquicamata. But the point of the story is that whenever there has been resistance to the capitalist / colonial / imperialist project in Latin America, and we need to be very, very clear that resistance has been there from the very beginning, right? Since the 15th century. This is the kind of thing that happens, right? The kind of thing that happened in Chile. And as you said at the beginning, Chile, not only was there this ultra right-wing fascist coup to teach a lesson to the entire region, this is what will happen to you, right, if you go down this route. It was also, along with Indonesia, the laboratory for neoliberalism, which continues to be in place in Chile right now, right, as an economic system. It's one of the most neoliberal countries in the world, and it is now being challenged by the new government under Gabriel Boric.
Yes, I was just going to mention that these kinds of resistances that you're talking about are still very much ongoing and are really influential on processes there right now.
Yes, and are very often are successful. Like if you look at the Bolivian project, like what's been happening in Bolivia since 2005, even after that horrific coup in 2019.
Right, they came right back. Yeah.
Right? There's a really progressive government under, I think her name is Xiomara Castro, right? In Honduras right now. The Venezuelan project continues to move forward, no matter what we all might think about it. I'm going to be very clear. I am pro Venezuela, especially the thousands of communes that are there. That's what really interests me. And I consider myself a Chavista. What I mean by being a Chavista is that Chavez's vision of communes, right? And his ultimate vision, right? Which is not just his vision, of course, right? But his ultimate vision was that all of Latin America ultimately someday, right, no longer be nation states, but actually just be communes. Like, let's go back to the commons pre-capitalism, right? But what would it look like now? What would 21st century communes look like? And there's a few in Venezuela that I think are leading the way, in terms of communes, right? So there's a really exciting things that are happening in Latin America. I'm a huge supporter of Cuba, who, there's a country that continues to provide universal health care to all of its citizens, despite 60 years of US blockade. And the blockade has gotten much worse during COVID, right? And under Trump and under Biden. So I could go on.
A bipartisan consensus against them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I think there's really exciting stuff that has always been happening in Latin America. Canada has never had a socialist president. Latin America has had many, right? Canada has never had an indigenous president. Bolivia has had, Evo Morales was elected in 2005, etc. Right? So, I always look at Latin America as a source of inspiration.
Let's go a little bit into that transition that you already opened up, how at 22, you started to pursue your dream of being a theater artist, being an actor, and you've been many things besides an actor as well. Can you talk a little bit about the moments in which you started to move into that lifestyle and where the sparks were for that? And you've talked about that also as being something that really grounded you after that really extreme upbringing.
Yeah, well, I always knew that was my calling. I think that the only way that you can do it and stay in it is if it's your calling, because as it's such a hard goal, you're basically in the business of public humiliation all the time. It's, financially, it's very difficult, etc. Right? I don't need to tell you that. But it was very hard. It has been very hard. I started to go to theater school here in Vancouver in 1990. The systemic racism in the theater sector, was, I would say quite extreme, mostly in the sense of there being a complete lack of opportunity for a person like me, right? So obviously not in people calling me, racist slurs or anything like that, right? Like in the theater community, of course not, right? I'm talking about a system, right? A system that really upholds white stories, and really specifically middle class, right? Middle and upper class white stories, right? And it's really telling to me that we rarely talk about class in the theater sector in Canada, because so many of the people who are part of the sector come from the middle and upper classes, right?
So there's this bit of elitism built in.
Yeah. So it was very hard because of the systemic racism, and I knew almost immediately that I would need to fight that in order to get anywhere and to create space for stories like coming from people like myself, to have access to those resources, to be taken seriously. And really, at the end of the day, just to create space for stories by and for and about people like myself, right? And I knew that it would be a very, very, very hard battle because middle class white liberals, which is the demographic of the theater sector, even if that's not what you look like, right? So I always say, you know, you don't actually have to be a white middle class liberal to be one, right? You know?
It's the market ultimately that you have to play for.
Yeah, and also that's who makes up the people who are creating theater in this country, right? So I knew that it would be a very difficult struggle because that demographic, the white middle class liberals, do not like to be confronted with terms like systemic racism or white supremacy, you know? And so the reaction will always be to pathologize people like me. She's crazy. She's out of control. She's an extremist. How dare she? So that's basically what I dealt with for decades. Until about 2 years ago when George Floyd was murdered, and this whole conversation became mainstream in the theater sector. Right. You know, I mean, there's a whole bunch of us who've been having this conversation and in the struggle for decades, but it became mainstream in the theater sector. Right. And so now it was no longer pathologized the way it was before, you know, to be using terms like systemic racism or terms like white supremacy.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I saw a quote of yours that you said you were once told that your work limited the audience of a theater company instead of expanding it.
I was told that all the time.
Wow.
Yeah. I have letters, rejection letters that literally say, we do not do Latin work. Huh. Right? Today, that would be an unacceptable letter to write, you know, because that is actually a racist thing to say, right? I mean, I don't need to explain it, but I will, right? It's the equivalent of saying we don't do Black work. We don't do Jewish work. We don't do, fill in the blank, right? You can't say that anymore, right? I was told that to my face many times, and I have letters stating that, which is why I had no choice but to create my own work and to create my own spaces and to come up with my own resources and, learning how to write a grant immediately after graduating from theater school and, in the early 90s, because I understood there's no way you're ever going to make it if you don't, right? Yeah.
I think this is a really good point to delve into some very challenging terrain that you navigate with a great deal of nuance, because you have done so much work to make historically marginalized voices present. And at the same time, we are in a moment where we perhaps don't know how to navigate all of the waters around systemic racism and around identity politics, which is where you actually have some objection to the term identity politics and some of the practices that are going on. And I think for a lot of identity politics, of course, are attacked a lot on the right. Sometimes they're attacked by the economic left, but there's also the degree to which people who are trying to engage in politics that could be called identity politics are coming to them in good faith. They mean to stand up for social justice. People like myself recognize that certainly we have had problems with unconscious biases, misunderstandings, and we are trying to approach that in good faith as well. But perhaps there are some steps that you feel are more aggressive around that scene. So did you want to address some of that terrain?
Yeah, I mean, I think it, like you say, it's very complicated. It's gotten very complicated, and I think there's the way that I see it, there's a few things to look at here, right? So, I mean, the term identity politics was coined by the Combahee River Collective, which was a socialist, feminist, Black collective in the 1970s. And basically what they stated was there are certain, communities, for example, Black women, right, who nobody else is going to fight for them. So they have to fight for themselves. Right. And they were saying this within the context of the of Black liberation movements in the United States, which were being led overwhelmingly by men. where these women were like, excuse me, Black women have, yes, of course we have a similar struggle to Black men, but we also have some other needs, right?
Right.
And also in the context of the white feminist movement in the United States, which was referring to women as a whole, as opposed to, no, you're referring to white women. Right? You cannot say that you, a middle-class white woman in New York City, has the same struggle as a working-class Black woman in the Southern United States in the 60s and 70s. That is preposterous, right? Absolutely preposterous. So that is the context in which this the term identity politics was first coined, and that is the struggle that I was engaged in that began in 1990 when I first went to theater school. That's where I was coming from. That is to say, I never saw it as a sectarian movement or as a separatist movement. It was, hey, we're all in this together. The people united will never be defeated. So we all have to be united. And here's some special things that we need to look at as women of color, okay? So as a socialist, for me personally, for example, let's pretend there were to be a socialist revolution, one of the things that I think that we have all learned is that it all has to happen at the same time. Economic justice and this other kind of justice that we're talking about has to happen at the same time. We can't just put economic justice at the forefront and hope that everything else will fall into place. That has been a mistake in the past. So that's why the Combahee River Collective came to be. Right? They're like, it all has to happen at the same time. And we as Black women know what our struggle is. So we're going to tell you about it. You don't know what it is. So let me tell you. Let me tell you what it is, right? As opposed to the neoliberal identity politic that has taken over the theater sector, which basically sees identity as a currency and as a commodity to be traded in, right? And has actually, as far as I can see, kind of turned into a separatist or sectarian thing, right? For me, it was always about expansion. Let's expand what's happening on our stages. Let's expand the stories that we're telling. Let's expand the bodies that are telling the stories, as opposed to, you get out, now it's my turn. Right? That whole, that there's a limited amount of resources, there's a limited, let's all fight over it, is not what I was fighting for. I was fighting more for expansion. I could go on here forever, as you can imagine, right? But I think I hit on some of the points that you were bringing up. Yeah.
Yeah, and so really on the other side of, say, a scarcity mindset.
Yes.
Yeah, there is. I have a question for you that comes actually from an earlier interview that I did with Dr. Harriet Fraad, who was one of the early members of the women's liberation movement, and she said some stuff to me that I didn't know about, which is part of the reason that for these interviews. And she said that there was a concerted effort by the CIA to take class out of the feminist movement pretty early on. Do you feel that some of the issues that you're seeing in that sectarianism have perhaps some orchestration behind them? Do you think there is perhaps big, I don't know about the CIA, but perhaps that there is some big money trying to steer social movements in particular directions right now? Or do you think it's more of something that is just arising out of the complication of the issues?
I wouldn't be surprised if the feds are behind it. Right? Let me give you an example. Not that long ago, I mean, this whole thing about people like yourself, for example, being kind of asked to refer to yourselves as settlers. That was very questionable to me when that started to happen, when all of a sudden, people who are actually immigrants, right, or whose background is an immigrant background a few generations ago, are calling themselves settlers. You know, I find that very, no pun intended, unsettling. Because when I hear a person who might be Jewish and who might be the grandchild of Jewish refugees who arrived in this country fleeing the Holocaust, for God's sake, right? Calling themselves a settler, I just go, whoa, let's just like stop here for a second and take a deep breath. What am I talking about? Like, I'm talking about identity politics again. And why did I bring up the feds? How convenient to all of a sudden put the settler colonialist project on the hands of individual immigrants, as opposed to themselves, the actual government of Canada. Oh, so now it's an individual problem, and I have to feel bad because somebody migrated from point A to point B. I would never call myself a settler. I call myself a visitor, you know, and when I arrive on this land, which is stolen land, as a visitor, I understand that my responsibility is to take care of this land. But I have never come here, and very few people have, very few working people have come here with the intention to steal land, to exploit Indigenous people. No, right? And most of, you know, all of the leftist Indigenous people that I know agree, you know. So maybe that is, there is something behind that. Like maybe the feds are behind that. All of a sudden having everybody and their dog call themselves a settler, which until very recently went along with the word colonist, right? Settler, colonist. Very, very interesting to me.
So just that consistent unloading of the systemic issue onto the individual.
Onto the individual, yeah. And I think this identity, this neoliberal identity politic, and it's also neoliberal because it's all about self-identifying. And I'm not talking about gender here. I would never do that. I'm talking about race, right? There's a problem with that. There's a problem with merely self-identifying, right? You can't just self-identify. I'm talking about race again, right? You cannot just self-identify. You've got to have a lived experience of whatever you're claiming to be. Like if you claim to be Latina, you've got to have a lived experience of Latinidad. You've got to have a connection to the Latinx community wherever you are, you know? You've got to have some kind of connection as opposed to, well, you know, I know my grandmother was Cuban. I never really knew her, but I was raised. No, that's not enough, right? But again, the self, it's all about the self, this neoliberal, right? As you know, the neoliberal ideology states that there is no society, there is just the individual. And that the basic characteristic of human relations is competition as opposed to solidarity. You know, so that this is where we run into problems with neoliberal identity politics and the competition and the self-identification and the separatism. And the currency, right? Seeing it as a commodity and as a currency. So it is very divisive, and it has led to so much lateral violence in our sector. Yeah.
Are there examples that you see of things going in a healthier direction? Are there places that we should be looking to find out how to, you know, the more progressive elements that we do have? And there's, I think, a lot of goodwill right now and a lot of desire to move in a progressive direction and a lot of confusion as to how best to do that. Are there examples we should be looking for or principles that we should be turning to?
Well, I mean, again, are we talking about the theater still, in the theater world?
I think that's a great starting place.
Yes, okay. So for example, currently for the last, I don't know how long, year, I guess, I've been working as artistic associate of new play development at the Stratford Festival. And one of the things that we did last fall is we had a week-long kind of gathering at Stratford. And we brought in a bunch of racialized theater people, mostly from Ontario, but you know, some from other places, and their allies and our allies. And we really wanted to do a deep dive into challenging this current mode that we find ourselves in terms of casting, that we decided to call literal casting, right? And what would it look like if we started to talk about counter identity casting And why would we do that, right? Because one of the things that we wanted to explore was to tackle the question, is literal casting, so that is to say, if I write a play that's with all Chilean characters, only Chilean or Latinx people should play those roles, right? In Canada, I'm talking about, right? Is that the ultimate goal? Is that what we want to be doing in 30 years and 60 years and 100 years? Or is that just a step on the way to something more? You know, and what could that something more look like? Could it look like counter-identity casting, which is not colorblind casting, wherein we all pretend we're white, or we're all like neutral, whatever the hell that means, right? And we just pretend like, oh, I'm going to pretend that I'm not seeing that a Black person is playing a white character. No. Counter-identity casting is kind of what Lin-Manuel Miranda did in Hamilton, right? He very purposefully cast those roles with particular races for a purpose, right? Counter-identity casting is much more than what he did, right? But that's just one example, right? So we did that last fall, and it was really informative, and we had some great debates, and some people were not happy with it, and other people were very happy with it, and everything in between, right? But I think it was a good way to start to bring all kinds of different people into the room and to have these uncomfortable conversations, and just to really start to address the separatism and the sectarianism that has been happening. Yeah.
That's fascinating. That's delving deep and taking a kind of experimental approach to it, as opposed to a completely pre-carved out direction.
Yeah, and one of the things that we did is we had debates, and we actually grabbed two plays. One was called Mojada, a Medea in East Los Angeles. I think that's what the title is, by Luis Alfaro, Chicanx playwright, all Mexican characters, and we purposefully cast it with. I think there were 3 Latinx people in it, but the other 3, like one was a Japanese-Canadian actor, another one was a white actor, another one was an indigenous actor from Turtle Island. We did that purposely to see what that would do, and what does somebody who's not literally Latinx or Chicanx or Mexican, what do they actually bring to the room? How does this help the process? How does this help the play? How does it elevate it? What layers are brought in, right? So we did it with that play and with another play called Dilemma of a Ghost by Ama Ata Aidu, who is a playwright from Ghana. Ghana? Yes, Ghana. Same thing, like mostly Black cast, but not all, right? But very purposefully. And what does that do, right? Yeah, so we experimented with that.
That's fantastic. That's that experimental approach. I just want to bring in something that I've heard you talk about before, which is that you don't trust an absolute idea. You don't like the idea of an ultimate truth being imposed upon a group of people. And it sounds like that experimental approach that you're speaking to there is more of a, okay, we have some principles for jumping in and figuring things out, and let's see what we find out along the way. Would that be, I'm not putting words in your mouth here.
No, that's great. That's exactly it. Yeah, I just really don't believe in absolute truths. I believe in universal truths, and collectively us, exploring stuff. And at the end of that week, we ended up with way more questions than answers. And that's exactly where we wanted to end up, right? To just start to open up the conversation again, Yeah.
I'm going to give you one last question to bring it home, which is, what have you found in your journeys going between your activism and your artwork? Is there a relationship between your artwork, things that you've learned in your artwork that you find would be useful for us to consider at the social level as we talk about politics and economics, or the things that have been figured out in the world of art for you that you see as having repercussions for the broader society?
Oh boy. I don't know if this is answering your question or not, but I don't believe that any art is apolitical. All art is political, no matter how much you want to deny it. And, I very purposefully create art that's that is unabashedly left-wing. You know, almost all the art that I see, let me talk about theater. The theater that I see in Canada it has a liberal politic. And so very purposefully, you know, try to not shy away from putting my politics on stage, never with a message. I don't believe in message plays or morality plays or anything like that. Just always asking a question, you know, and trying to find as much nuance as possible in the story that I'm telling.
And that's, I think, a great way to approach our general body politic. Fantastic.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. This is such an enlightening interview. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
Okay.
I should mention, what's the next thing that you've got coming up? I should give you a chance to plug your next material.
Oh gosh, let's think. I don't even know. I've got a lot of stuff in the fire.
Well,
the next production of, anyway, I can't even speak about it because papers haven't been signed, contracts haven't been signed, but there's lots of stuff coming down the pike.
Great. Everybody do an internet search. Fantastic.
Okay.